Michael Terpin. So please welcome Michael to the stage.
You get the Bitcoin orange.
I have it, yes.
Michael brought his book today. If everyone wants to take a look.
Bitcoin Super Cycle, distributed by Simon & Schuster, easily available on Amazon.
Nice. Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us today. Very excited to have you at HasselCK's event. I'm very curious to hear, we'll first start off with introductions, but very curious to hear about what sparked your initial interest into the Bitcoin space, and how has your thesis changed over time or even maintained consistent?
Sure. So I've always been interested in technology. Both of my younger brothers are technologists. One went to MIT Artificial Intelligence Lab, studied with Minsky years ago. The other one's got a couple degrees in physics, computer science, etc. And so I guess I was sort of the non-tech that still loved tech. And I always had curiosity for things that are new, and had the blessing and curse of finding things before a lot of other people did. I say blessing and curse because you find things early before anybody's really buying them, and people laugh at you and what's this internet thing? What are these personal computers? What's that for? And so the internet was really sort of one of the first big ones that I saw really early and thought this was going to change the world. And I'm going around in 1992, 93 saying the internet's going to change everything. And they're like, what the heck's an internet? Why do I care? And so I saw the same thing then, and then I got to ride that up and make a lot of money on that. I started the first internet-based press release distribution company, MarketWire, and we raised some angel funds for that, and then got funded by Sequoia Capital, and we sold it for $35 million. Probably before we should have, because it got sold to another party a year later for $100 million, sold back to our partner NASDAQ a couple years after that for $200 million, and NASDAQ sold it most recently to Apollo for $350 million, and I'm told it's a $500 million division now. So my babies kept growing. I got one check out of it, but that's okay. I went on to do other things. Social media, I was fascinated with in early 2001, and that was way before really took off. I was a beta tester at MySpace, and met Zuck when he was first launching Facebook, and I got really excited about that space. A lot of these spaces, though, as they grow, the word I use is calcify. They sort of just get old and static, and there's no more innovation. You can't find anybody saying, hey, I've got a new telephone startup, right? Or I've got a new internet startup. It's a given, everything's on the internet. And social media became something that after, every year you'd have some new exciting platform, Instagram and Foursquare, etc. And then after, I'd say about maybe 2014, 15, done. All the winners were picked. And, and so I get less interested in an industry when all of a sudden all the innovation is gone. I think that's going to be a long time for crypto and for Bitcoin. And I discovered Bitcoin in 2013, and I had the same reactions I did when I discovered, doubled down on the internet in 93, and social media in 2003, something about the threes, and then I'd heard about Bitcoin in 2012, and I didn't really start getting, knee deep into it until early 2013, and then I was just all in.
Nice. And I believe, also as what you said, it will take a while before we start to calcify. And I think we're just at the start of all these innovations. So it's a very exciting time out.
Yeah, and with Bitcoin, I mean, that was the one that most people who are more altcoiners think of Bitcoin as granddaddy and kind of boring, and obviously it's you have not been paying attention. Because, as we've seen today, the things that are going on with layer 2 and with the yield solutions, etc., and ordinals and runes, it's just really the beginning of it. I think for the most part, I am, first of all, not a Bitcoin maximalist, I'm a Bitcoin preferentialist. So I coined that term to basically say, I think that there is room in the world for a multi-chain future, and I think a lot of the innovation happens first on other chains, And then if it's going to scale, the Bitcoiners will figure out how to go and do it on Bitcoin. And at the end of the day, while I support innovation in other chains and I invest in innovation in other chains, at the end of the day, I count my wealth in Bitcoin.
And you've been over the years consistently supporting these early stage innovation startups, like from Bit Angels to Transform Ventures. Very curious to hear of any patterns you see when backing these new projects, even projects in crypto, and if you have any kinds of advice or any takeaways for any founders in the audience.
So it's all about the narrative of the cycle, and obviously my book is on the Bitcoin cycles, but the altcoins follow the Bitcoin cycle. You basically have the 4 seasons. I said years ago that when Bitcoin gets a cold, altcoins get pneumonia, and you see much further pullbacks in the altcoins, and cycle after cycle. If you bought Bitcoin, sold at the peak, bought it back at the bottom, wash and repeat, that actually does outperform just holding Bitcoin, and that's a big part of the book. However, you can't do that with altcoins. So in other words, if you did that with Ripple, if you did that with most altcoins, you did it with Chainlink, you'd be way down versus Bitcoin. Because what happens is the altcoins, if you're going to do that, you have to change the narrative every cycle. With Bitcoin, you don't. So in other words, excuse me, almost all of the altcoins. Water here, just because I think I just need water.
Yes, there is water over there.
Okay.
Anyone in the audience, fine. Thank you so much.
Okay. So it's dry. It's Vegas, right? So all the altcoins had different narratives each cycle, whereas Bitcoin, even though it's got different, kind of forms of narrative, it's still Bitcoin is the preferred asset. It's always been the consistent narrative. Also, Bitcoin is the store of value. I think is more proven. I've been saying recently that Satoshi failed in his vision of being able to have peer-to-peer money, but he succeeded, I think, beyond his wildest dreams so far. Of course, who knows what his wildest dreams are, in terms of having it be a store of value that will be larger than gold in the near future. And but what it also did was it enabled stablecoins. And again, there's obviously now people trying to do stablecoins on Bitcoin, but stablecoins is really the first kind of global killer app, and it's expanding wildly now that the regulators are feeling comfortable with it, not being a bank, but particularly in the U.S., finally we have an administration that realizes it's helping the dollar for people to buy massive amounts of and so that's what we're seeing there. But if you look at every cycle, if you're investing in altcoins, Bitcoin, again, keep buying Bitcoin, but what I say in the book is, hold Bitcoin for 3 years and then hold cash for 1, because it's the second year of the cycle that you always get the peak. So far it's been within a 37-day period, and then the only years you can lose money in Bitcoin were 3 years out of 16, and it was consistent. It was a year after the halving is the peak, and then the year after that is the crash. And so the only years you could have lost money buying in January and selling in the summer were 2014, 2018, 2022, and you're probably going to lose money in 26.
Got it. And just on this topic of the 4 seasons of the Bitcoin model that you coined in your book, you mentioned that, for example, Bitcoin compared to altcoins follow more consistent cycles. But curious to hear about any other sort of external factors, like with regulations, market sentiment, or even halving events that may affect this model.
Sure. So my thesis is that the halving is the most important thing, and because that's supply and demand, and Satoshi talks about it in the white paper. If in any given cycle there is more new Bitcoin needing to be bought because there's new users or the users are using more of it, and that exceeds the supply of new Bitcoin coming on the market, the price has to go up. The thing is, it doesn't go up in a straight line. Markets never go up in a straight line. And so I've identified, and I really started this narrative in 2015, and it just got stronger and stronger. So that's why I felt I needed to put out the book. Originally I was going to call it The 4 Seasons of Bitcoin, but my publisher liked Bitcoin Supercycle better because there's 2 parts of the book, really. There's one that is explaining for traditional investors, why Bitcoin has been such a great investment. That it's not a Ponzi scheme. It's not what your stockbroker told you in 2015, and why it's going to continue to outperform, commodities and stocks and bonds for the foreseeable future, certainly the next 20 years. And, so that's a big part of it. And the other part is the super cycle part, which is we've had diminishing returns of very large gains, right? So the first halving was 100x from having the high, and then an 85% pullback. The second halving was a 30x, still substantial in 1 year, 30x, and then a pullback of 83%. The third halving should have been 10x, 100x, 30x, next logical number mathematically is going to be 10x, but we had really bad macro. We had the Biden administration, we had the Elizabeth Warren's war on crypto, the bank's war on people, being able to have bank accounts and crypto at the same time. And you then had this rapid rise in interest rates that, pretty much killed off a lot of, risk asset classes. And so, but it didn't go, I was on a panel once with someone who said, well, I think that interest rates are more important than having, and it's just like, you're wrong, because if they were, then we'd still be around $8,000 Bitcoin, because that's what it was before these interest rates went up. And so, the macro, the last time around, tamped us down, so instead of going up to 85,000, we only ended up going to like 68, and then at the very end of the cycle, we had a wick up because of the ETFs being approved to 78.5, and that became the new all-time high for that cycle. And my thesis on Bitcoin summer, Bitcoin spring starts the day of the halving, so when the seed of the new season is planted. It's the shortest season, lasts 4 to 7 months so far. It's a little bit longer every time. And then the day that you pass the last all-time high, shoots up like a rocket ship, and this time was no exception. November 5th, passed 78,750 after 6 months of being very flat, and within 3 weeks we're over 100K. And so usually that cycle, the Bitcoin summer usually lasts about 9 to 11 months. This time maybe it'll be 12. But pundits who said, oh, 109 was the top and it's going to crash to 30K, they just don't know what they're talking about. That would have you believe that the entire bull market is only 2 months, and that's just not reasonable.
And another aspect of the Bitcoin super cycle of your book talks a bit about some use cases as well. And you mentioned about strengthening the visual store of value narrative and some other use cases that come from it, like with payments.
You really read the book.
I skimmed through it, would like to take a deeper read. Payments, cross-border transactions, and you even mentioned previously like these Bitcoin-backed stablecoins as well. Are there any types of use cases that you feel most optimistic about, coming into the future, or maybe some underhyped use cases that deserve more attention?
I think you're going to find in the very near future, and this is what's going to power the super cycle. The super cycle is when the diminishing returns that we've had, 100x and 30x and 10x, that gets turned around and reverses for a period of time when we go through what all disruptive technologies go through, which is the S-curve of adoption. So when you had the internet, when you had mobile phones, you had color TVs, you end up going from a very small number of early adopters because the price is high, the technology doesn't work perfectly, and it's only the visionaries and the easily excitable that are willing to take the time to learn things that get in really early, that happen with cell phones. How many people wanted to carry around a $3,000 brick? I did, but I'm an early adopter of things. And but once they become the flip phone and they're cheap and your friends all have them, that's when they shot up from 5 or 6% of the population to now we're technically over 100% because people have multiple phones. And that happened. The S curve happened very rapidly in the 2000s, early 2000s, coming out of in the new millennium, and after 9/11, etc. And so that will happen with Bitcoin. But here's the thing: when the internet exploded, when the mobile phones exploded, that was a boom for technologies that built things, right? So Microsoft exploded, Cisco exploded when they needed new servers. Bitcoin miners always have to work with the amount of Bitcoin, right? They can't become all of a sudden, well, I'm going to mine 5,000 Bitcoin today. No, there's a limit of 450 a day that's going to go down to 225 a day after 2028, and it's going to go down to 112 and a half, and then it's going to be under 100, and it's going to keep going. The final 40 years of the Bitcoin cycles, how many Bitcoin do you think are mined in the final 40 years? Total. 40. How many do you think? How many Bitcoin in the final 40 years? The final 10 cycles?
In 40 years.
In 40 years, how many Bitcoin out of 21 million?
Maybe half that, maybe more, a little more.
2.5 Bitcoin.
Oh, 2.5.
Yeah.
Oh gosh.
I mean, we had 10 million Bitcoin in the first cycle,
Yeah.
then 5 million, then 2.5 million, then 1.25. This cycle, 625. You keep on having things, you know, it goes down to very small numbers. And so that's why, as the S-curve of adoption happens, and you go from 5% to 50% in, say, 10 or 15 years, that's 10x the Bitcoin that's needed. Where's it coming from? Price has to go up. But again, it doesn't go up in a straight line. So the super cycle is going to be when the macro of, you know, supply shock happens, and particularly it usually happens in a bull market because that's when people get frenzied, and we haven't even started involving retail this cycle yet. And so when they get in and say, oh my God, Bitcoin just hit 200,000, I'm going to mortgage my house because it'll be $1 million in 3 months, and then they're wrong and they panic sell. Excuse me. So part of this book is to show people to buy low and sell high, not to panic in at the top and then panic sell at the bottom.
Great advice. And I'm also curious to hear some of your thoughts on Bitcoin becoming more programmable. A lot of the projects, companies that are involved in today's event are using different methods, such as BitVM2, to make Bitcoin more programmable and open new applications like, for example, trust minimized bridging between different ecosystems, or even Bitcoin-backed stablecoins, other decentralized finance-related applications. How do you think this would affect the current narrative of Bitcoin, that being, for example, it being a store of value system or being digital gold?
Well, you know, I don't think it affects the demand for Bitcoin because, quite frankly, a lot of these solutions are variations of becoming or emulating an altcoin, or sometimes they actually have other coins that sort of assist them. So it's an innovation, and I think that it's great for Bitcoin. But I think that it's not going to be the thing that, you know, powers Bitcoin from 100,000 to 1 million. It is going to be something that perhaps, you know, increases Bitcoin dominance. Because if all of a sudden you've got, I mean, I'm an investor to a number of Bitcoin, you know, layer 2 projects, including, I like stuff that settles on chain. I've got a number of these companies who are here. I have a conference, by the way, that's on Thursday and Friday and Saturday of this week. It's called Tokenize. If you go to tokenizeconference.com, we still have tickets. If you're an investor, accredited investor in projects, you get in free. Otherwise, it's $1,750, half price if you're a Vegas local. You can also just DM me at Michael Terpin on Telegram or Twitter, and you know, tell me if you're interested in any aspect of it. We got some great speakers coming up, and we got Bruce Fenton, and we got, you know, so we have 30 projects presenting, and a number of them are actually Bitcoin, you know, layer 2. I'm an investor in Tachi, which is developing EVMs for, I mean, Solana EVM, I mean, Solana virtual machine and smart contracts and EVM directly on Satoshis. So settles on chain. And I'm also, you know, investor advisor in like Bima and, you know, 3 or 4 other companies that are in the, you know, and I've been a long time, you know, investor and advisor to CoreDAO. And so, yeah, I'm definitely very excited about, you know, Bitcoin layer 2 being one of the key narratives of the cycle. Every cycle has different narratives, right? So the last cycle, the 3 things that really made you money were if you're investing early in the right coins in metaverse, NFTs, and DeFi. DeFi is still going. Not much new traction in metaverse or NFTs. So that was sort of a one trick wonder for that cycle. Prior cycle before that, everything was about, you know, well, there was a little bit of layer 2s, the early layer 2s, and then of course you had, you know, just the ICO boom.
So for this cycle specifically, you think that Bitcoin L2s are really the power?
I think for this cycle, it's one of the narratives. I think the other one, the biggest one is AI. And then the other one is real world assets. Real world assets is still really early. There's a lot of fluff around that because, you know, it reminds me of NFTs in the way that you have far more supply than demand. When NFTs started making money, when people came out and sold this NFT for like $60-something million, every artist thought they were going to be a millionaire. And so they could create unlimited amounts of NFTs, but the number of buyers stayed about the same. And I think the same thing is going to be the rule in terms of certain parts of the real world assets. Right now, the main arguable ways that have scaled have been tokenizing T-bills, right? And but real estate, you know, I don't think there's a lot of demand, even there's a lot of supply for tokenizing the house around the block. You know, now if you can go and tokenize a portfolio of top tier, you know, grade A, you know, 4A or whatever, New York City real estate that pays a good dividend, and you can go and get it paid in stable coins, and it's available, no questions asked, 24/7, 365 to investors in Argentina, you know, that's something that could be very popular.
Absolutely. And also wanted to hear your thoughts on what's really needed for Bitcoin to become a global financial infrastructure for everyone. Is the infrastructure we currently developed, do you think, mature enough to support this real wave of Bitcoin native applications? What sort of developments do you think need to be made?
I think the main thing is a combination of regulatory clarity, which we're getting toward, at least in the United States. Europe seems to be going the other way at the moment, sadly, but we'll see if they follow the U.S. when the U.S. you know, becomes much more prosperous because of that. Ease of use, right? I mean, most technologists think about utility first, and you know, if they can use it, they think it's great. But you know, how many people can show their grandma how to use MetaMask? Not many, right? And so it's not going to scale with that, right? Whereas I think that what's going to be the big, you know, one of the big 2 or 3 mass adopters is once Apple and Facebook and the brands you're already used to using that have massive amounts of adoption, you know, and didn't exist 30 years ago, right? I mean, Facebook didn't exist, you know, in the 90s. Google, you know, was born in the late 90s, and these are the biggest companies in the world now. And so Amazon, you know, born in the late 90s. And so when they all start, you know, accepting stable coins, and they will, so all of a sudden grandma can go, she's already got an iPhone, you know, her kids gave her an iPhone a few years ago, and she figured out how to use it, and that gets her on the internet. You know, years ago, I remember in the early days of the internet, an executive at one of the major TV stations, it was NBC, he said, you know what, the internet is never going to take off. My mom is not going to go and get on the internet because she's not going to put a second phone line in her house. She's not going to go and, like, you know, deal with being woken up in the middle of the night when someone's trying to send her something and it goes bing, 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 Okay, it doesn't do that anymore. We have broadband, right? It's like, here, mom, here's an iPhone. It's way faster than, you know, what you had as broadband. And so now it's a given. And, you know, and so I think it'll be a given in 2 to 5 years that your iPhone, not only can you pay your bill with your credit card that's already an Apple Pay, you can pay with stablecoins. And if every place you go, it says, if you want to pay with your credit card, we accept Visa, MasterCard, Amex, but you have to add 3 to 4% on your bill. We ain't paying for it. But if you do stablecoins, it's free. A lot of people are going to say, okay, do I need the credit card points more, or do I want to save, like, you know, $30 on every $1,000 I spend?
And yeah, you mentioned a couple of factors, like with on the regulatory side, and I really appreciate you for also bringing up the user experience side as well. Perhaps we can get to a point where even our grandmothers, people who are not part of this young generation, can, you know, also take part in this, and that will really help speed up that adoption as well. But curious to hear also about, just on the institution side, where do you think we are in terms of institutional adoption? Have you been seeing any trends?
Yeah, I mean, it's really taking off this time. I think the tipping point happened with the ETF approval, that major Wall Street banks figured, okay, if you can't fight them, join them. We weren't able to go and kill crypto off, and you know, the narrative for a while was sort of the belief that, you know, the banks would be like, let's start an internal team, figure out how to make our own crypto, and it'll be better than Bitcoin because we already have the customer base. Didn't happen. I mean, most of their experiments were just disasters. You know, JP Morgan had spent a lot of time on this thing called, I think it was Quorum or something like that. And finally they ended up saying, you know what, I mean, they were hoping that would like kill consensus. Instead, they just gave it to consensus and gave them money and said, you know what, you guys build programs better than we do. And let's just, invest in the leaders and tell them what we need as a use case. And I think same thing now that you see that Bitcoin is the big winner. I mean, it's 2/3 of all crypto, including stable coins. I think what you're going to see is you're going to see that the average person is going to have a wallet on their iPhone. They're going to have a bank account that lets them go and send stable coins back and forth. Because right now, if you got stable coins and you have a bank account, it takes you 3 days to wire something, right? You take your stable coins, you have to go to Coinbase or whatever you're using and convert it and then wire the money to you. It takes a day, maybe 2 days. Under Biden, they might shut down your bank account because, whoa, Coinbase, what's that? Is that crypto? And then once you get it, then you have to go and wire it to another party because the regulations will not let you wire it to anybody other than you. So now, what Caitlin Long has done with Custodia Bank, and I think she's going to be getting approval pretty quickly, and they're in all 50 states and other banks will copy it, is you can KYC once for your self-custody wallet, right? And then just send stable coins into your bank. They'll go and real time convert it to dollars and wire it for you. Now you've gone from 3 days to convert stable coins into US dollars that you can send to pay a bill that doesn't accept stable coins, which most places will in the near future, to instant.
Absolutely. And also wanted to ask you about Puerto Rico specifically, because I know that you were one of the first to initiate it.
I was the
Yes.
first person to move there from crypto,
Wow.
yes, early
Nice.
2016.
Nice. So I'm very curious to hear what sort of opportunities do you see with Puerto Rico having greater adoption for crypto? And for
It's not about greater adoption, it's the only place in the world, it's the Dubai of America. If I move to Dubai, I still have to pay the IRS.
Right.
The only place that Americans don't pay the IRS is Puerto Rico. And it's basically because the 5 territories do not pay the US, they pay the territories. Puerto Rico struck a deal with the IRS that said, if you live in Puerto Rico, you pay the territory of Puerto Rico, you do not pay the IRS other than your American real estate. And they have the right to not tax you either, because they want to bring money into the island, and it's been actually quite a success in terms of the amount of new business in restaurants and home sales. I mean, it's been so successful that they're complaining that the rents were going up in the better neighborhoods, and that's usually something that is a sign of success. There were some protests saying, oh, I can't afford my old apartment, but you can't afford it in Wynwood anymore in Miami either, because that was a gentrifying neighborhood. So usually that's a good thing, and so it's brought a lot of wealth to Puerto Rico. But it's also just an update. They just changed the law a couple weeks ago. This is the last year you can apply to get 0%. And if you move to Puerto Rico this year, you get 0% of your capital gains through 2035. If you wait till next year, it's 4%. And then in 2035, originally it was going to expire. Now it's going to be, you can have an extension through the year 2054 at 4%.
So this year is the year.
This is the year, you can still do it.
Yep. And just as a last question before we close today's session, so you've founded quite a few PR firms previously. I'm very curious, if you were to design a global PR campaign for Bitcoin adoption today, what would your core message focus on?
That's a good question. I mean, in the early days, I tried to get some of the big players to sort of unite among one message, and they were all kind of promoting their own thing. I mean, there's, I think that, we do support the Chamber of Digital Commerce. Since the beginning, we've done pro bono PR for them. And, them, Stand With Crypto, there's a lot of great voices for the industry now. And I think basically it's freedom money. It gives you the ability to basically be your own bank, to not deal with these restrictions that the banking industry has had globally for a long time, that they tell you what to do with your money and when you can access it and why. That's it.
Exactly. Bitcoin is freedom. I think that's the main reason why we're all here, the main takeaway. So thank you so much, Michael. Really appreciate all your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chairs really sink in.
Thank you, Michael. And last up, thank you everyone in the audience for sticking around towards the end of the day.